Good evening. Welcome to Simpson at 8. Social media has become a dominant feature in people's lives today. It has encompassed people's personal, business, and political life and is now coming under scrutiny by the government and authorities. Joining me this evening to discuss the social media phenomenon is USP scholar and tutor Jope Tarai, who has studied and written on the issues here in Fiji. Mr. Tarai, thank you for joining me on Simpson at 8.
No worry.
So why did you decide to study and write about social media in Fiji? Why did you think it was an important topic worth researching and studying?
Social media in Fiji, a lot of what had started with our research colleagues, and namely Mr. Glenn Fina, who's currently a PhD candidate in Australia, in the University of New South Wales, if I'm correct, Edinburgh campus, and Mr. Romitesh Kant, who had completed his master's with the USP, and Jason Titifenue, who's also part of the teaching team. Early on, before 2014 elections, Glenn had motivated us and told us that there's a lot of things that's happening, and this could be something that will have a lot of implications. So
it's like a new movement was
building. And so a lot of the things that we had individually seen online, we started to realize that it was important to write about it and also try to investigate what are some of the sort of academic ways of trying to quantify and qualify some of the events that were happening before the 2014 elections. And of course, as we look back now, we see that social media had quite a significant part to play in terms of campaigning for some political parties and not so much others. And that being different now in 2018, that they've all come on board.
They've all come on board. So how they use social media in 2014 and 2019, quite different.
Yes.
Because it's more intense now.
Absolutely. Very different. It's quite evident as well that only certain parties were switched on to what was happening on social media insofar as 2014 was concerned. There were some political parties who did not have a strategy whatsoever in terms of reaching out to targeted audiences. But the main party, the government of the day, were very switched on, and obviously they had a lot more resources. 2018, everybody was very much aware, every political party and political candidate, and not only specifically targeting the main populated social media site, but other social media sites. Yeah. So that really expanded.
And some, it wasn't really the party, it was the particular candidates, specific candidates themselves,
yes,
that had a much better, much more smarter strategy to reach out to their
audiences. Yes, definitely. I mean, for 2018, there's quite a variety of already well-known personalities, at least in the central division, that transferred a lot of their already built public profile onto social media, and certain candidates themselves as individuals. In 2014, it was a bit more different. The political parties had to try and push for particular candidates' profiles online. And so in that regard, 2018 really stood out, and it's shown a greater expansion in terms of individual candidates. For instance, Linda Tambue's campaign is quite expensive in terms of its depth and the way it's sort of done in a very skillful way. Lenora Tambue has her own profile that really has a massive reach when you look at it in terms of the analytics and various others. So that's quite different in terms of opposition government members compared to 2014 and how that's expanded.
Because for the Fiji First parties, Fiji First Party, they centered all their votes around Bainimarama. And Sodelpa tried the same, but really within Sodelpa, the opposition parties, you had to try and gain your own votes because you had to make about 3,000 to be in the top 20. Yes. So you had to introduce yourself either through your traditional links or through social media to gain the extra few hundred more votes.
Yes, that's actually quite true. I mean, even in 2014 for Fiji First, their strategy was largely just focusing on the party leader and the different personalities that he had. You know, some of the profiles had him as a grandfather holding his grandchildren. Some of the other profiles had him as a statesman, sort of like figure. And other profiles just showed him being with the common people, walking around on the streets, you know, shaking hands. So they centered around the individual personality of the party leader. While for opposition, they themselves also had a similar strategy, but the massive public profile of individuals in itself also amplified the whole collective strategy, which you can see in terms of the voting allocations and votes gathered.
And you can see with social media, before we go into the other aspects that we will be discussing, that there was the narrative that were trying to be being built up, and then there was the opposition attempts to tear down the image that the other party was trying to create for their leader. So you see the way...
yes, I mean, when we look at Fiji First, there's a lot of paternalistic projections, and obviously for both sides. for opposition, SUDELP as such, because they have very senior military-like figures, very masculine projections of these particular figures. And in a way, the varieties of ways this is seen and the narratives that's built around that is sort of challenged. So there are strong issues on women, there's strong issues on children, and it's always sort of targeting each other. And it's interesting how it plays out because of the fact that well, at least for the Linda campaign, it really fits into her targeted audience, the narrative that is built. So her targeted audience, you can tell from the way the campaign is built, is the youth, the young, and sports related. And the creative way that they've done that is facilitating sports activities and then driving media campaigns around that, social media campaigns around that. And that really, and
the volleyball movement.
Yes, the volleyball movement and various other, I think they had an artist do a song and things like that, and catchy tunes. That in itself shows the different narratives that's built, and specifically targeting which particular audiences.
Younger audience that she was targeting. Let's step back a bit now and describe the origins of the rise of social media to where we are today, where we're discussing the nuances, the narratives being created, the attacks, you know, the very sophisticated attacks to tear down the image that's been created of one person, to make them look like a corrupt, untrustworthy person, or to make them look much more capable than maybe what they are. Now, this really began around 10 to 15 years ago, and one could argue it really boomed in the last 5 years, as we've just been discussed. So how do you see the origins and factors that have contributed to the rise of social media in people's lives today? Because it's overtaken, in some aspects, some parts of it have overtaken what traditional media used to hold. A lot, you know, letters to the editor. The debates are now just firing off on social media. So how do you see the factors that have contributed to the rise of social media and why people are using it so readily today?
Well, there's all sorts of discussions about media landscapes and the impact on media landscapes because of social media. But specifically for our country in Fiji, we have to recognize that there's an underlying political history that exists, that prevails, that's always constrained and made the media landscape very fragile. And that's not limited to the events of 2006, and that goes far back as '87. But what's different with the political events of 2006 is the direct constraining and attack, in a way, on the media landscape. And that in itself has created an environment where more and more people who have become active online users.
The time there was censorship, there was limitations put on the media.
Direct news censors.
Quite aggressive.
Yes, so that evolution of those forms of censorship has basically coincided or had a direct relationship with social media use or internet use. So in the early days of 2006 or shortly after 2006, you had blogs that sprouted, and then as Facebook came into the fold, Facebook also sprouted because more and more people felt they needed to have these discussions that they were limited from having, or if not, did not really see those discussions having instantaneous responses with traditional media through print media and so on.
Because in the initial, you know, when the 2006 coup took place, a lot of the criticism, commentary that was actually undertaken was on the websites and the blogs. Coup 4.5, you know, some of the notorious intelligentsia. And that's where a lot of people who were looking for anti-government or more alternative information went to seek insights of what they wanted to see, that they felt that they were not getting from the mainstream media. Not many were on Facebook then or in the social media then. We now see that those blogs and those sites more or less have
fizzled out.
They are now quite a bit defunct. They don't exist anymore. Majority of Fiji's population are now participating on social media. Now you talked about that landscape that we came through, which was a lot of people felt there were even those that you know, a lot of the debates started to take place. Letters to the editor uncensored. That were some of those that started to come out. If we recall, the debates that because people felt the mainstream media were no longer doing the work that they were doing. How did you see that impact?
Well, that sort of evolved around 2011, sort of 4 or 5 years after 2006. And also at the same time, we have to recognize that when people were writing in their letters, they felt that it wasn't represented the way they wanted it represented, if it ever got published at all. And so having those particular groups is a representation of that transition from traditional media to social media because of the political landscape and the constraints. And ever since then, people still have felt that they don't have that particular opportunity. So that transfer from what was then traditional media or letters to the traditional media to social media is in a way similar trend from what it was in 2006 to blogs. But only this time around, blogs don't have that instantaneous element that you can see who exactly is commenting and instantaneously get updated, because in 2006 most of the internet access compared to now was more desktop related. You know, people went to internet cafes, people had if they had desktops at homes, in their homes. Now in 2011, with digital technologies, handheld devices, smartphones, you can instantaneously see what somebody's upset about and what they want to talk about and what they want to vent about. But still, Letters to the Editor Uncensored in its original step was quite huge for people that knew about it. But its membership is still small compared to massive groups that exist now. And so, but the idea there is quite monumental in the sense that it was accommodating what traditional media was constrained or handcuffed from having to express.
Yeah, and one thing that that came about was that people saw the ability to mask themselves, create fake identities, and then free themselves up to say or do whatever they wanted to do on social media. And someone could argue that the government, in terms of constraining the traditional media, created another monster, so to speak.
See, it's
a place that they are now trying to control.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's very interesting you should mention it that way, because right now that's what's often overlooked. What's often overlooked in the discussions about media landscape, social media landscape, is the fact that there's a reason why people assume hidden identities, because of the fact that they fear a lot of things from that moment or from that political situation that we've always had. And in that way, it's created that, as you say, that monster of anonymity. But we also must recognize some people, not everyone that assumes an anonymous identity has only vindictive or vitriolic things to say. So there are some people who actually take on an anonymous identity online for the purposes of exposing some of the serious issues. And of course, their stories are never going to be understood, or it's going to be overwhelmed or overshadowed by the various other vitriolic content. But certainly, definitely, this is created by the fact that people don't feel safe or see that the space of traditional media is not as safe as it was, or at least the way they thought it should be.
So we'll leave it there for now. Interesting discussion. We're with Jope Tarai discussing social media phenomenon in Fiji. You're watching Simpson at 8. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Simpson at 8. I'm with Jope Tarai, USP tutor, scholar, who studied social media, and we've been discussing how social media is now where the action is. It's outgrowing mainstream media channels, one could argue, as the platform for debates and discussion. All political parties, as we mentioned, are all now on social media. So how are you seeing the way it's changed political debate and activism in the country?
Well, it's definitely escalated very quickly. It's transformed it in a very instantaneous way. It's very quick, and also it's provided a closer relationship between those that are politicians and the voters or the citizens. So it's basically moved that space much closer. And also at the same time, it's also allowed people to see a variety of personalities of their political figures. So it's not always a straight suit kind of a person. What are they like socially? What are they like with their families and so on? So
the things they're doing,
yes, what are they doing?
So what are they eating?
What are they eating? What are they cooking and things like that. So it's bringing that relationship between the voter and those that you vote for much closer. And at the same time, it creates more scrutiny in terms of discussions. And also it bears a lot more pressure on those in power, or at least in decision-making processes, to be very transparent or clear.
Well, there's direct feedback right now, instantaneous. Whether they like you or not, you can say it can be nasty or it can be nice. You can get praise and a big stab at the same time.
At the same time.
And in some ways, for the mainstream media, it's a challenge now, because before they were the medium that came through before they reached the people. So information was checked and verified, and now the lines are going direct. So there's no way for people to know how the information is
being transferred,
is solid, has been verified, or has been checked to see that it's.
Yes, there's always going to be a concern about the credibility and also the accuracy of particular information. And I think that's the biggest challenge that now prevails in terms of media, the news, and how that is going to transform in the next couple of years is really going to depend on the authorities involved, the journalists involved, or at least those that are going to have to look at this in the coming years. Because so many things is moving so quickly, there's very little time to take a step back and check the accuracy of this information and provide checks and balances for that. And how that will come about, I think it really depends on how people should be encouraged to be switched on, or educating people, or providing educational sort of focused awareness programs about them checking the information, what they see, and how quick it can come across, especially when we're talking about news media that can be at times very questionable or very, very concerning.
Because you can see a story of someone doing something, go for 3 days before people find out that it's not actually a true story. And we've seen even some, it's going so fast that even the mainstream media are struggling to catch up. They're under pressure because it's almost like the others are breaking the news for them,
Yes.
Before they can even report it, someone said there's an accident over here, there's a death.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the fascinating and equally frustrating nature of social media in terms of the ability for it to create viral content. So when content goes viral, it's difficult for media practitioners to ignore it, especially because if you look at the dynamics of the public interest, the media is supposed to provide, report and information on the public interest. If the public interest is already being expressed on an alternative space, they have no choice but to catch up on it, even if the content of that viral content may be very much questionable. I mean, the Nambo accident, if I remember it correctly, is a very good example of how things were moved online first. And one of the biggest forums that we have in Fiji, which is always sort of criticized very strongly by mainstream media and other authorities, being Chat Fiji, has capabilities to make content become viral. And that's a great example because of the fact that there are over 200,000 active accounts. In a country
there's a quarter of the country.
Yes, more or less.
In action.
Yes. And when you take, part of our research work is to utilize a variety of analytics to assess the quantitative data. When you take the media analytics or social media analytics more specifically, it indicates, of course, there's over 200,000, but at any given point, Chat Fiji has over 60,000 active accounts talking, discussing, liking, whatever, And in that regard, it really does make you see that the world is very much digital in that regard. 60,000 people are talking.
Raw, unfiltered?
Yes.
And it's going for days, the comments. It's going to 1,000 comments, 2,000 comments.
Just non-stop. And when you look at the membership, again, the fascinating thing about analytics is it provides you all this statistical analysis. You can see why it's continuous, the discussions are continuous, because it has the largest amount of membership from Fiji, and then after that you have the regional numbers. So Fijians perhaps in the region are also engaging, and then from around the world. So when Fijians at home go to sleep, there are Fijians from around the world also actively engaging in this.
So it's non-stop. There's no time to sit down and absorb.
Exactly.
You see sometimes when they go after someone, and it's become brutal and nasty, you see some people trying to stop it, but it's like it's an unstoppable thing just keep growing. I sometimes go on to some of those pages and it feels like the wild front, West Frontier. Hundreds of years ago, no lawless, everyone's doing their own thing. Anything goes, so to speak. So where do you see this heading? Is there any way to rein it in, or is just gonna? It's something that it's going to be the beast that it is.
Yes, I think, especially for these kind of discussions that can evolve into cyberbullying and affect people's mental health, these kind of things need to be taken very seriously. And I think that's where there's a certain part of what the Online Safety Commission has been talking about is significant and important in having to create this level of awareness and massive campaigns to approach people and provide for them that information that this is what the harm that this does, if we're talking about serious emotional harm and distress. And not only approach it in that way, but take it much deeper in vernacularizing it and so forth, so that it brings this understanding of what we see and what other people don't see. Because when, as you say, the momentum goes, people in Fiji have what I call a very caustic sense of humor. We spoil each other. So to some, it maybe...
But the pile-on...
Yes, the pile-on, it can evolve into
Yeah.
other things that really starts to affect someone's mental health. And of course, emotional sensitivities. So we really have to acknowledge having to take stock of it with greater, not only awareness campaigns, but more strategic and more focused and innovative ways to inform people about this is the serious harm that we're looking at, and this is what this has caused.
Yeah, because some of it really borders on hate.
Mm.
You know, I had someone here recently, after I interviewed the person, I saw the comments that was made about that person. On social media, I felt taken aback. I felt bad for having done that interview because of the nasty things that went on to even about the person's hair, and you know, it just went off, and it can really affect affect people. So that issue, that Online Safety Act, and I'm talking about Anne Dunn, in terms of the Online Safety Commissioner, who became bullied for the things that she was there to stop bullying. How do you see that act? Has government approached this whole thing in the right way?
First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge too that I think it's important for us to recognize our political landscape has been very sort of constrained, that people have very polarized views. And social media being as it's such, this is the only avenue where people are able to let that out. And a lot of this, the polarization of our politics in itself, has really culminated in people going way off the deep end.
Not quite extreme.
Yes, very extreme. Especially when we know ourselves as the friendly islands and all these things. It sort of makes people wonder.
And some people you meet in real life and what they say on social media is
different
totally
from
different.
What they are. Yes,
they're a totally different animal.
Exactly.
On Facebook.
Especially in political discussions, because their political expression in itself, it's really constrained offline. And so online, it takes over, and it basically becomes that monster, but not justifying what's done. It's completely something that should not be justified. On the basis of the act, I would have hoped, and I made a submission on this to the committee, the standing committee, that there should have been more time. And the very fact of the matter is we have an estimated close to 500,000 active online users. Even if you discount those figures on the basis of those that have multiple accounts or fake accounts, that still means that there's a significant proportion,
number.
Well over, or if not even more than 250,000 of our population that are online. And so I would have hoped that it would have been more targeted in expanding the consultation process.
And more studies being done, more
yes,
research
absolutely.
being done.
I mean, that is so right.
Just to assess
what
really is happening. Who are these people?
Who are these people? What is happening here? And also to separate the issues. If we're talking about online safety, this is the particular issue around online safety. If you're talking about political discussions, this is about political discussions. If you're talking about cybercrime and stealing money online, this is the issue, the categories. Not to conflate them all into one.
Because they're all conflated at the moment.
Very much conflated. And in that way, it's all confused in its approach. And also you can see how a lot of the authorities are speaking in such a way that it sometimes doesn't make sense. If you're talking about cybercrime in terms of its international dynamics, financial fraud, or if you're talking about cyberbullying locally, and then what does that mean for free speech and political discussions where people feel entitled to?
Now, according to the government, the Online Safety Act and the Commission is mainly about the bullying and the, the trolling, all those cyber stalking, unlawful image transmission, exposure to offensive or harmful content, particularly for children. Surely all these things we need protection from. But there's also the aspect of protecting free speech, political discourse, and not being taken to task for expressing your freedom of expression. So those kind of things we sort of probably needed to, what do you think, made a better clear demarcation line, so to speak. But can you actually do that?
Well, it would have been nice to have more public discourse on it. I think more and more people should have been invited and given the opportunity to air their views on this. And also, I definitely am of the opinion that Parliament should have more time to talk about this, because these particular elements are very crucial. Safety and, of course, the safety of free speech and expression being protected. To me, there was just not enough time, and there wasn't enough clarity on having to discuss these things. And also, at the same time, to make clear to the public in such a way, because there's a massive amount of distrust in those that don't support particular ideas. And there's no point in, I mean, let's be very honest about this. Laws cannot solve everything. It's only part of what can be a solution. If the people don't feel an ownership over these issues, in resolving the issues, then we can't expect the issue to be collectively and constructively solved. So laws are only a part of it. It can't solve everything. So if we don't have enough time for as much people as possible, a lot of people to add their views and have greater sense of ownership over resolving the issue, then we will end up having this sense of distrust and lacking public confidence in what the intent of the Commission and what the intent of these discussions is supposed to be about.
Right. So do you see the Act or the Commission as a threat to free speech?
I see the Commission and the Act in itself as attempting to protect cyberbullying, but the public response indicates otherwise. So the public appears to be not convinced.
So the perception is...
Yes, the perception.
And that comes from the insecurity and suspicion
yes,
of this government, so to speak.
Yes,
in
towards
particular.
the government.
So what would be your recommendation? How would you change or amend
well, first and
what has happened?
First and foremost, it would
What measures would you prefer to be done?
First and foremost, I think it would be good is to, in no disrespect to anybody involved, because the matter is public confidence. When you have a political candidate of a party who becomes in charge of that particular authority, it's inevitable for the public to spike in their skepticism. And if you look at a lot of the responses that we're seeing, it really is because of that closeness of relationship of the commissioner.
And it went a bit personal.
Yes, and it got to a point where it got personal. And so public confidence is denied when you see that close relationship, or if not that relationship of that political relationship. I think that needs to be addressed. If we're going to talk about safety, then people need to trust those involved in...
So it must really look and appear to be independent.
Yes.
And then so get their confidence back.
Yes, and that's the first thing. And again, I say this in all due respect to the individuals involved. The second element is, if we're hearing about this is a genuine democracy, this is a meritocracy, there's a lot of questions about the credentials of those that ultimately get appointed in these positions. And so we need to clarify on what basis is a person qualified to fulfill this position. And again, in no disrespect, because the public's personal skews against this and all of these things are coming from, in one way or the other, from these particularly evident aspects. It's like the elephants in the room. The political association of the individuals involved in safety, a so-called safety commission, and of course the meritocratic arguments around it. And then of course you just have people that are just extreme. But I think if we are to approach this in terms of buying the public confidence, we need them to be on our side, because at the end of the day, these rules are supposed to be for
the public.
Yes, that needs to be addressed very clearly, and then undertake a collective holistic research. For instance, if we're looking at social media use, Facebook is the most prominent social networking site. The Western Division and the Central Division have the largest population on size. They actively use it with smartphones and specific times. If you look at the most active times, it's usually in the morning before work starts, lunch hour, and from 4:30 to about 7 p.m. before they reach their families, get into dinner. Those are the targeted times. So this sort of the basic aspects about research and approaching it in terms of really seeing some of the finer facets of what can be targeted and what can be left alone. So
creating that greater awareness, understanding,
and specific
restoring
research.
and regaining the
Public confidence.
Confidence into the institution.
Yes.
We'll leave that there for now. We'll be watching Simpson at 8. Don't go away. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Simpson at 8. We're with Jope Tarai. Interesting and exciting discussion on social media and how it's being used, how it's changing the landscape, the political landscape, the social landscape, the personal landscape, relationships and issues. And we touched a bit earlier about the bullying and people's behavior, things that in some ways people that were unknown and were unheard of before have become personalities. Everyone's become their own, become star of a certain group.
15 minutes of fame.
The 15 minutes of fame.
Andy Warhol.
And then there is the pressure now, personal, of putting out new content, of putting things out. How do you see its impact on culture and behavior? We've talked about politics, but there's also the aspect on how this is impacting culture and behavior. Because on Facebook, yeah, you can be a chief or someone, but everybody can come at you at the same level.
Yes, so it's sort of a double-edged sword in the sense that it does bring people to a certain platform where, in a way, everyone's sort of equal, where you can say certain things, especially if you don't know them. But once you know a little bit more about their offline background and their real life background, then there are certain ways in which you judge that approach. And just as you said, with chiefs, once you understand that there's a chief involved or there's somebody of a particular social or cultural positioning, then that dynamics of relationship changes automatically.
They don't have that aura, that mystery, because now you can see, this is like the rest of us.
Yes, just like the rest of us. So it cuts both ways. So in terms of that particular digital culture, it does bring a certain sense of equality, while at the same time, it can also provide people to think that there aren't any boundaries. So people can push it to the extent of being rude instead of being sort of critical in terms of discussions, or it's sort of outlandish in the way they approach each other. On the other hand, it can also provide for opportunities to ask very tough questions about relationships and things like that. So it can go either way in terms of relationships. But especially for cyberbullying, is very concerning because of the fact that more and more younger generation are exposing themselves to social media and digital technologies. And I think it places pressure on the family unit, which is, I think, significantly important in this day and age. You know, what parental responsibilities about talking to children, social media use, and of reaffirming them, at least for the first decade of their lives, or at least once they turn 12, 13, you know, this is the way the real world works in terms of relationships, that there are ways in which you communicate, but ultimately after that, this is the online world, and that it needs to be made clear.
It's a world that's really invasive, you know, it comes into, and you know, we've been talking about research and study about the political implications, but in terms of the social and cultural, the behavior, that research also needs to be done.
Yes.
Has anyone done work?
There's part of that in terms of digital anthropology. There's a few scholars out of Australia. I know of Professor Heather Horst, who I work with from time to time, who's doing a lot of research or some research around that, which is very interesting because it does indicate the risks involved. For particular traditional structures that we have, family units, you know, community structures, and at the same time, again,
the communication.
Yes, the communication.
Everyone's on the
yes, because you know, when you talk about the formative years of a person's life, from 5 to 10 years old, where they learn about, or we all learn about, this is the way relationships are, communication, and so on. If that gets blurred with the digital culture that's evolving, there's going to be problems or at least there's going to be changes that our traditional structures might not be able to comprehend or be overwhelmed with, which is something we see
quite
now.
wide-ranging.
Yes. Language,
the way
and approaches to language in itself, and the way people communicate or addressing particular matters. Yes.
Yeah. So you know, there's the image now that I always have, that there's this 50-inch TV in the living room.
Yes.
And you see the mother, father, son, daughter. TV's on, but they're on their phones. They're playing. So it's creating a new dynamic.
Yes.
So, and then we've been talking about the serious side, you know, about, but there's also an entertaining side. You know, you know, there's a lot of nice videos that we laugh at and we share. So it really has come to dominate our life. You know, there's no other way to describe it. It's all encompassing.
Well, to me, it depends on the individual, but also it depends on, again, I emphasize the family unit. I think it's important to recognize that we still have some autonomy as individuals, as human beings.
We still have the power.
Yes. So it's basically subject to our choice of what we want to do. So some people do social media cleanses, as they call it, or some people actively make a decision not to utilize their phones while they're with family, at least for a certain time while they're eating. And I think those are healthy habits that can inculcate.
Because we are not powerless. We should always remember we are in control.
Yes, we are the ones in control of it, and not to let it control us. And at the same time too, while it does provide entertainment, you know, it helps us de-stress for some things and keep in touch and so on. At the end of the day, we are the self-autonomous agent here, and not the phone. And so once we lose sight of being that autonomous agent in this particular relationship, I think that's where we become dominated.
The addiction takes us over,
yes.
so to speak. Yeah? We now see government ministers. I mean, they were there, but now in a very big way. The Prime Minister embracing Facebook and Twitter. Starting their own Facebook and Twitter accounts, taking their messages straight to the people, talking directly to them. Hey, I'm here now. We are in where it was recently, Germany, to to fight on climate change. I'm here with India, Serura too. So they're now talking directly to the people. It's not not even going through the Ministry of Information. It's him
directly
through Facebook to the people. Why do you think they're now engaging this way?
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because even when I saw that announcement that they had, new Facebook pages, I thought they already have those pages since 2014. What's happening? And so when I looked at it much closer, it became obvious that the new approach is to personalize.
Personal connection.
Yes, to feed into that personal connection and relationship with the voters and the general public. Before, it was very official. It was on sort of that platform where this person is that state-affiliated person and you are here. This time around, it's sort of trying to bridge that connection. At the same time, too, we have to recognize that a lot of the way that opposition has evolved in the way they use social media is creating this competition. In 2014, Fiji First was the winner of the day in terms of social media and, of course, elections. 2018, on the other hand, there's more competition on social media use. So the personalized connection is, in a way, feeding into the excessive or the expansion of that competition from the social media use of opposition members as well, with a personalized touch, direct communication, live videos, and also with the family images, again, taking on another step, another level, and the direct communication with high school students, if you will. So in that regard, it provides some sense of humanizing the political situation, or attempting to humanize that, I'm here working hard for you out here in overseas and so on.
And of course, they're also learning from other world leaders. Donald Trump, the super power of Twitter, some would say. Narendra Modi of India. So leaders, political parties, governments, now people are creating their own news, their own information, their own perspectives, taking it directly to the people. It's not just leaders too, the people themselves are looking at this information and creating their own content through their posts. It's becoming like news sources, and you see some people who are consumers have actually become suppliers of information. You have a number of people, freelance writers, personalities. They've become sort of citizen journalism. That's quite a new phenomenon that's happening now.
Yes, I think it definitely is obvious. I mean, there's certain people who are already well known in certain parts, and so they create a cultivated personality, a social media personality.
Especially if they're controversial.
Yes, if they're controversial. And at the same time, if they're quite well known, what they value would become or have a particular effect on people. But in terms of citizen journalism, it's definitely going to put a lot of stress or challenge or pressure on traditional media because of the fact that citizen journalists are releasing information so quickly, however, so it may be inaccurate or incorrect at certain times. And so in that regard, citizen journalism is expanding, and you have individuals who are acting like more or less news organizations at certain points or the other. But again, the pressure will be on traditional media because of the fact that this is catching a lot of fire, and always traditional media has particular standards to follow. Citizen journalism, on the other hand, can fall far short of certain standards that's usually sort of appreciated or practiced.
So in the end, you will have to determine what is a credible source of this, because some are doing good freelance work.
Yes, very much so.
I know Anish Chand,
for
instance, who's a former colleague. He's doing his own, and he's basically he's based in Rakiraki. He's doing, and he also mentioned, and I just like to tell the story, that he sent out a tweet about some of the things being done. Later, a minister turned up last year and said that they came to check that situation out based on a tweet seen by the Prime Minister. And according to Anish, he was the only one that sent the tweet. So, sending these things out from the location where you are can be very powerful.
Can be very powerful, and especially, again, it's drawing that bridge between those in the government, a business of government, and those that are being governed. So you don't have to go through the typical protocols before to get your message across. And so it's shortening that, but also at the same time, it's also creating more awareness for responsibility for those in power.
And many people now have their own people checking their social media account to make sure they respond effectively. Because if they don't respond, it spreads that they do not respond.
They are not responsive, and that they don't have some accountability, or at least some obligation to be accountable to certain things. So again, it's saturating possibilities for governance or good governance in the future. And that's something that I want to emphasize, that there's an opportunity that is here for Fiji in terms of creating greater awareness, participation, citizen engagement in those tenets of what we would see as sort of a democratic society. It just depends on how we are going to work together and how it's going to be utilized for the future, especially, again, in those in the business of government and those that are governed.
Yeah, that's great stuff. So one of the major things, catchphrases being grappled on with right now is fake news, the term fake news and the spread of fake news, so to speak, and you've mentioned a little bit. But in your opinion, what would be the best way to address fake news?
I think
however one defines it, news that's not true or news you don't agree with. Or
yes. First and foremost, I think we need to acknowledge where this catchphrase comes from. It comes from the Trump era. And also at the same time, it's heightened by a world leader that is very controversial, a world leader who has created that controversial reputation out of manipulating social media in such a way. And so if we're looking at fake news, we have to recognize that it's coming out of a particular political vantage point. At the same time, locally, we also have to recognize that there's been so much constraints at times that there's a lot of people that will follow particular news very quickly. But to me, fake news only becomes...
Especially news they love, even if they think it's wrong.
Tabloid or... It, yes, very much so. So for me, if traditional media picks up what is on social media without vetting it, to me that then becomes a very concerning element of fake news. Because of the fact that what's on social media, you can read it, but at some point or the other, of course, some people might believe it, but the traditional and professional standards remains with the traditional media.
With the mainstream media.
Mainstream media. So I think that particular level, it only can become fake news to a certain extent or a very massive extent if it is taken by traditional media outlets and then they publish it in such a way, because at some point people using social media will know that there are particular traditional media outlets that have a particular standard, and people see that and they look up to that. While online, it's more or less anybody's.
All right. The final question. From your observations and things that you see in your writings and stuff, what would you like to see done next? What needs to be done?
I think there has to be
next steps.
The next steps that have to be unfold outside of trying to regain public confidence from the Commission and so on, is really a massive educational and awareness program, and also to provide
through schools,
through not only schools, but I think it has to target where you have the larger users. So target Central Division, Western Division first, and then of course with the schools, yes, that's part of it, but also go beyond that to the communities, because the families, they have to have some level of digital literacy. You know, because when you target the families, you can tell them that if you have a child that you continuously give this smartphone all the time, these are the consequences that you're drawing for your child and your family.
And once you do something awkward or weird or stupid, it's recorded and it can be there forever.
Yes, exactly. And not only having that approach to go out into the communities themselves, you know, engage the different networks of interfaith religious organizations that have a particular level where families listen to these particular institutions, so that it can really capture their attention as, hey, this is serious. And while at the same time, to what I'm hoping, apart from research, is to vernacularize that approach, you know, in the major ethnic communities, in indigenous Fijian, in Indo-Fijian, and so that families can take this seriously too, because sometimes the language barrier that's there about the discrepancies or the consequences are not taken very seriously. Like a great example is if you talk about fake news. When people started sharing that little Wikipedia page that the Tawus, of those from Kandavu, were making fun of people from Kandavu for their first language being Chinese Mandarin, that was intended as a joke from the Tawus. But in the Western world, it's constituted as, this is completely fake news, you know, this and that, somebody's making this up to defame these people, blah, blah, blah.
The nuances.
Yes, so that's why I'm thinking about, you know, ultimately to vernacularize it and continuously update it in terms of not only financial costs or economic costs, but the social and cultural implications that this will have. And so that people make an informed decision as a family or as somebody that's a guardian in charge of a child, what do we want to do? And instead of being reactive, when a problem happens, then people start pointing, you know, fingers at social media. Social media is the problem, but having them to be informed beforehand so that people are more proactive in that regard. And lastly, I'd like to say that social media is more or less a reflection, like a mirror. it reflects what people have in the far recesses of their mind or otherwise. Social media just depends on how people use it and informed of using it. At the end of the day, it's us individually as human beings.
It's the real raw looking right at the mirror and
Yes,
straight
very
right
much.
at you. Jope Tarai, thank you for joining us on Simpson 8. Unaka. That was Simpson 8 for the evening. Nimi is next with Talimangimangi. Join me again next Sunday at the same time. Good night.